What if the discomfort you've been feeling around someone lately isn't overthinking, but a warning your spirit noticed before your mind could explain it? Think about that for a moment, because many people dismiss these moments as anxiety, imagination, or emotional sensitivity. But sometimes the first signal that something is wrong does not arrive as clear evidence. It arrives as quiet tension, a subtle shift, a strange absence of peace that you can feel but cannot easily explain. And if you've experienced that recently, you're not alone. Many people in seasons of spiritual growth begin to notice the same pattern. Conversations that once felt normal suddenly feel heavy. Interactions that used to energize you now leave you strangely exhausted. Someone familiar, someone you've known for a long time, begins to create a quiet discomfort in your spirit. Nothing dramatic happens. No obvious betrayal. No loud conflict. But something feels different, and the natural reaction is to doubt yourself. You wonder if you are reading too much into things. You tell yourself you are probably just tired, stressed, or overly sensitive. But what if that discomfort is not paranoia at all? What if it is the beginning of discernment? Discernment rarely begins with clear proof. It begins with awareness, with subtle shifts in emotional and spiritual perception. And throughout Scripture, we see that God often allows people to sense something before they fully understand it. There is a reason for that. If every truth arrived with immediate evidence, there would be no need for wisdom. But wisdom grows in the space between sensing and understanding. The Bible gives us a simple but powerful principle in Luke 8 verse 17. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Eventually, what is hidden becomes visible. But notice something important. The verse speaks about what will be revealed later. That means there is often a period of time when the truth is still hidden. During that period, discernment becomes your guide. This is why God rarely exposes a situation all at once. Exposure is often the final step, not the first one. Before the truth becomes obvious, there is usually a quieter stage where your spirit begins to notice patterns. Small things, inconsistencies, emotional shifts, subtle signals that something is misaligned. It might be the way someone responds when you share good news. It might be the way certain conversations leave you feeling confused instead of encouraged. It might be the sense that your peace disappears when you enter certain environments. None of these things alone seem like proof, but together they form a pattern, and patterns are often how discernment speaks. The challenge is that most people ignore patterns when they first appear. We are taught to give people the benefit of the doubt. We want to believe the best about those around us. We don't want to misjudge anyone, and those are good instincts. But there is a difference between being compassionate and being unaware. Compassion listens with grace. Discernment listens with clarity. When the two work together, you begin to notice what your spirit has been trying to tell you all along. Sometimes the tension you feel around someone is not about what they said. It is about what remains unspoken. Sometimes the exhaustion you feel after certain interactions is not just emotional fatigue. It is the cost of navigating subtle misalignment. Your spirit notices the difference between genuine connection and hidden tension even before your mind can put words to it. And that is why discernment often feels confusing at first. Your heart senses something that logic cannot yet explain. This is where many people make the mistake of dismissing their own perception. They assume that because they cannot prove something, they must be wrong. But discernment does not always arrive with proof. It often arrives with awareness first. Evidence comes later. That is why God sometimes allows you to sense the atmosphere before revealing the full picture. It prepares you. It slows you down. It invites you to pay attention instead of moving forward automatically. And here is the key insight to understand. The warning you feel is rarely about a specific label, a name, or a dramatic revelation. It is about a pattern you have been overlooking, something that has repeated itself quietly in your life. Something you noticed once, then explained away, then noticed again. Over time, those small signals accumulate until your spirit begins to recognize them as more than coincidence. When that moment arrives, It does not mean you need to panic or accuse anyone. Discernment is not about suspicion. It is about awareness. God does not reveal patterns to make you fearful. He reveals them to help you walk wisely. And wisdom begins the moment you stop ignoring what your spirit has already noticed. Now that we understand how discernment often begins quietly, the next question becomes important. How does manipulation or spiritual sabotage actually work in real relationships? Because many people imagine sabotage as something dramatic. They picture obvious hostility, clear betrayal, or open opposition. But in real life, especially in relationships that once felt close, sabotage rarely looks aggressive. It rarely arrives with open conflict. In fact, the most confusing situations are the ones where nothing looks obviously wrong on the surface. Spiritual sabotage is rarely loud. More often, it appears as something that looks harmless at first. Sometimes it looks like curiosity. Someone asks a lot of questions about your plans, your goals, your decisions. On the surface, it sounds supportive. They seem interested. They want to know what you're doing next, how things are going, what you're working toward. But slowly you begin to notice a subtle pattern. The questions don't always lead to encouragement. Instead, they lead to doubt. After sharing your excitement, you leave the conversation feeling strangely uncertain. Other times it appears as subtle comparison. Someone casually mentions another person who is doing something similar to what you are doing, but supposedly doing it better. It's not said directly as criticism. It's framed as a casual observation. Yet the effect is the same. Instead of feeling supported, you feel slightly diminished. The conversation shifts from celebration to quiet competition. Sometimes sabotage hides behind disguised advice. Advice can be helpful when it comes from wisdom and genuine care. But advice can also be used to quietly redirect someone away from their confidence. It may sound like concern. Are you sure that's a good idea? Or maybe you should wait a little longer before doing that. Again, these words don't sound harmful by themselves. But when advice consistently leads you to question your instincts rather than strengthen them, something deeper may be happening. And then there is passive discouragement. This is one of the most subtle forms of influence. It doesn't attack your goals directly. Instead, it slowly drains the energy around them. Someone listens to your excitement, but their response is flat. They nod, but their tone carries hesitation. They say the right words, but the enthusiasm never quite reaches their eyes. And over time, those small moments begin to accumulate. Your spirit notices that your progress seems to make them uncomfortable, even if they never say it out loud. The Bible actually gives a powerful illustration of this kind of dynamic in the story of Samson and Delilah. When most people think about that story, they imagine betrayal happening suddenly. But if you read the narrative carefully, the process was gradual. Delilah did not attack Samson with force. She gained emotional access. She asked questions. She studied him. She learned his habits. She patiently waited until she understood his vulnerabilities. The danger in that story was not immediate violence. It was familiarity combined with access. This is an important pattern to understand. Manipulation rarely confronts your strengths directly. It studies your vulnerabilities instead. Someone who wants to influence you rarely tries to overpower your confidence. Instead, they observe where you are uncertain. They notice what you care about deeply. They watch how you respond when you feel pressure. And slowly, sometimes without fully realizing it themselves, they begin to influence those areas. This does not always come from malicious intent. Sometimes people act from insecurity rather than strategy. When someone feels threatened by another person's growth, they may unconsciously try to bring that person back to a level where they feel more comfortable. They might minimize your progress without meaning to. They might change the subject when you talk about something you're excited about. They might redirect conversations towards safer topics where they feel more confident. Psychologically, this happens because growth can disrupt relational balance. If two people have known each other for a long time, they become familiar with each other's roles. One person may be used to being the helper, the advisor, or the stronger one. When that balance changes, When someone begins to grow, heal, or step into a new level of purpose, it can create tension. And some people respond to that tension by trying to restore the old dynamic. This is why spiritual sabotage often feels confusing rather than hostile. The person may not openly oppose you. They may still care about you. They may still show moments of kindness and loyalty. But at the same time, their behavior subtly pulls you backward. Conversations slowly drain your clarity instead of strengthening it. Your confidence becomes something you feel you have to protect instead of something you can share freely. Over time, the pattern becomes clearer. You begin to notice that certain interactions consistently leave you feeling smaller. Not attacked, but reduced. Not rejected, but subtly discouraged. And that is when discernment becomes important again. Because spiritual sabotage rarely appears as direct opposition. It appears as influence that slowly shifts your perspective about yourself. And here is the key insight. Spiritual sabotage rarely attacks your strength. It studies your vulnerability. It observes where you doubt yourself. It notices where you seek approval. It quietly moves into those spaces and begins to shape your decisions from there. Understanding this doesn't mean you should become suspicious of everyone around you. The purpose of discernment is not to create fear. The purpose is awareness. When you understand how influence works, you stop assuming that every voice in your life is neutral. You begin to recognize that the people around you shape your confidence, your decisions, and even your sense of direction more than you realize. And once you recognize that influence, you can begin asking an important question. Not whether someone is good or bad, but something much more practical. Who currently has access to your decisions, your emotions, and your sense of direction? Because in the next part, we need to talk about something even deeper than manipulation itself. Often the biggest issue isn't simply what someone else is doing. The real issue is the level of access they have in your life. Now this brings us to a deeper realization, one that shifts the focus away from blame and toward wisdom. Because the biggest problem in many of these situations is not necessarily the person themselves. The deeper issue is often the level of access they have in your life. When people talk about difficult relationships, the conversation often becomes about whether someone is good or bad, loyal or disloyal, supportive or unsupportive. But life is rarely that simple. Most relationships exist in shades of gray. Someone can have good intentions and still not be the right influence for your next season. Someone can care about you and still carry insecurities that subtly affect your growth. That is why the question is not always, who is the problem? A wiser question is, who currently has access to my energy, my decisions, and my sense of direction? Access is powerful. The people who have consistent emotional access to you shape your internal world more than you might realize. Their reactions influence how confident you feel about your plans. Their tone affects whether you share your ideas freely or hold them back. Their presence can either reinforce your clarity or slowly erode it. And when someone has too much access, even small patterns begin to have a larger effect over time. There are certain signs that someone may have more access in your life than is healthy for your current season. One sign is when you find yourself constantly explaining your decisions to them. Instead of simply sharing what you're doing, you feel the need to justify it. You provide extra details, extra reasoning, extra reassurance. And even after explaining, you still leave the conversation feeling like your clarity has weakened rather than strengthened. Another sign is when you begin adjusting your excitement around them. Think about that carefully. When something good happens in your life, the natural response is joy. But if you notice that you hesitate to share good news with a particular person, or you minimize your enthusiasm so they won't react negatively, that is a signal worth paying attention to. You are not celebrating freely. You are managing someone else's emotional response. A third sign appears when you start to second-guess your own progress. Before certain conversations, you may feel confident about the direction you're moving in, but afterward you find yourself wondering whether you are doing the right thing at all. Nothing dramatic was said. There was no direct criticism. Yet somehow the conversation leaves you uncertain about decisions that once felt clear. And perhaps the most noticeable sign is emotional fatigue. You may notice that some interactions consistently leave you drained. Not because there was conflict, but because maintaining the relationship requires constant emotional adjustment. You listen carefully to avoid saying the wrong thing. You monitor your words to avoid triggering comparison or tension. Over time, that effort becomes exhausting. When you see these patterns together, it becomes clear that the real issue is not simply someone else's behavior. The deeper issue is how much space they occupy in your internal world. This is where responsibility becomes important, not blame, but awareness. Because while you cannot control another person's motives or insecurities, you do have influence over the access they have to your life. The Bible offers a powerful illustration of this principle in the story of Jonah. When Jonah tried to run from the direction God had given him, he boarded a ship heading in the opposite direction. At first, the sailors had no idea what was happening. They were simply doing their job, trying to sail through the sea like they always had. But suddenly a violent storm began to rise around them. The waves grew stronger. The wind became chaotic. Everyone on that ship felt the consequences, even though most of them had done nothing wrong. Eventually, the sailors realized that something deeper was happening. Jonah admitted that he was the one out of alignment with God's direction. His presence on that ship had brought turbulence to everyone around him. The storm wasn't random. It was connected to misalignment. Now, this story is not about blaming Jonah. It is about understanding a spiritual principle. Sometimes storms continue not because you are doing something wrong, but because someone connected to your journey is out of alignment with where you are supposed to go. Their presence may have made sense in a previous season. Their companionship may have been helpful when you were navigating different circumstances. But when seasons change, alignment matters more than familiarity. This is where many people struggle emotionally. Letting someone have less access does not mean you hate them. It does not mean they were never important in your life. It simply means the direction of your life has shifted. And when direction changes, proximity sometimes has to change as well. The difficult truth is this: not everyone who walked with you in one season is meant to walk with you in the next. Some relationships are designed for specific chapters of your story. They serve a purpose while you are learning certain lessons or navigating certain environments. But when growth happens, when your identity, priorities, or calling begins to change, the same relationships can begin to feel misaligned. That misalignment doesn't always show up as conflict. Sometimes it shows up as subtle friction. Conversations feel slightly off. Encouragement feels hesitant. Energy feels heavier than before. And if you ignore those signals long enough, the tension grows. Which leads us to an important insight. Some storms continue because the wrong passenger is still on your boat. Not because that person is evil. Not because they deliberately want to harm you. But simply because their direction and your direction are no longer the same. Recognizing this requires maturity. It requires the ability to step back and ask not only who someone is, but where they fit in the direction your life is moving now. And that brings us to the next important question. If certain relationships were connected to a previous season of your life, what happens when God begins preparing you for a new one? When people first begin to recognize misalignment in relationships, the immediate reaction is often emotional. It can feel like rejection, betrayal, or even guilt. Many people start asking themselves difficult questions. Did I misjudge this person? Am I abandoning someone who once supported me? Am I being too harsh or too sensitive? But spiritual growth often requires a deeper perspective, one that moves beyond labeling people as good or bad and instead understands something much more practical. Some relationships are seasonal. Not every connection in your life was designed to last forever. Some relationships are instructional. They appear during moments when you are learning something important about yourself, your boundaries, or your faith. Others are transitional. They walk with you through a specific chapter of your life, helping you navigate a period of uncertainty or growth. And then there are relationships that are meant to remain long-term. People whose direction continues to align with yours as you both grow. The challenge is that when a relationship has been meaningful in the past, it is easy to assume it must remain meaningful forever. But growth changes compatibility. As your priorities evolve, as your purpose becomes clearer, and as your spiritual discernment deepens, the type of environment you can thrive in begins to shift as well. What once felt comfortable may begin to feel restrictive. What once felt supportive may begin to feel heavy. This is not because someone suddenly became a bad person. Often it is simply because the role they played in your life has reached its natural conclusion. When we misunderstand this, we tend to demonize people unnecessarily. We search for flaws to justify distance, or we hold on to relationships long after their purpose has been fulfilled. But wisdom understands that seasons change. And when seasons change, proximity sometimes changes with them. The Bible gives us a powerful example of this idea in the story of Ruth. Ruth's life began in Moab, surrounded by familiar customs, familiar relationships, and a familiar future. But when circumstances shifted and Naomi prepared to return to Bethlehem, Ruth faced a defining moment. She could remain in the environment she had always known, or she could step into a completely new direction. Her decision required courage. Leaving Moab meant leaving familiarity. It meant walking into uncertainty without knowing exactly what waited ahead. Yet Ruth understood something important. She could not stay where her past was comfortable if her future was moving somewhere else. So she chose alignment over familiarity. She chose direction over comfort. What makes Ruth's story powerful is that her decision was not motivated by hatred toward the people she left behind. She did not condemn her past. She simply recognized that her life was being called toward a new place. That decision eventually led her into a completely different destiny, one she could never have discovered if she had stayed where things felt safe but stagnant. This is an important insight for anyone experiencing relational shifts during seasons of growth. You do not have to hate someone in order to outgrow the space you once shared. You do not need conflict to recognize misalignment. And you do not need dramatic betrayal to realize that your life is moving in a direction that some people cannot follow. Sometimes God removes toxic influence, but often what he removes is simply misaligned proximity. The difference is important. Toxicity involves harm. Misalignment involves direction. Two people can both be sincere, kind, and well-intentioned, yet still move toward completely different purposes in life. When that happens, distance is not punishment. It is clarity. It is the natural adjustment that allows both people to move toward the environments where they can grow most fully. And often, when you look back later, you realize that what felt like loss in the moment was actually preparation for the next stage of your journey. Because when God begins preparing you for a new season, he is not only shaping your opportunities, he is also shaping your environment, sometimes by closing doors, sometimes by opening new ones, and sometimes by quietly shifting the people who walk beside you. As we reach the end of this message, it's important to understand something that many people misunderstand about discernment and separation. Freedom does not always look dramatic. It is not always a confrontation. It is not always a loud declaration that someone is no longer welcome in your life. In fact, most of the time real freedom is much quieter than that. Freedom often begins with something simple but powerful: clarity. When clarity arrives, you stop feeling the need to argue with your own intuition. You stop trying to explain every decision to people who do not share your direction. And you stop forcing connections that no longer feel aligned with who you are becoming. Instead of constantly analyzing what someone meant or whether you misunderstood them, you begin to trust the signals that your spirit has been noticing all along. This is what emotional peace looks like. It is not the absence of relationships. It is the absence of confusion within them. When your relationships are aligned, conversations feel supportive instead of draining. Your growth feels celebrated instead of minimized. Your presence feels natural instead of carefully managed. You no longer feel like you must shrink parts of yourself to keep the peace. Spiritual alignment works the same way. When you begin to recognize where your direction is leading you, certain choices become easier. You no longer feel obligated to maintain every connection simply because it once mattered. You understand that life moves in seasons, and with those seasons come adjustments in proximity. Some people remain close. Others remain respected, but at a distance. And both outcomes can exist without bitterness. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. The tension you once felt slowly fades. The energy that used to go toward managing difficult dynamics returns to your own growth. You become more present in your purpose, more confident in your decisions, and more peaceful in your relationships. Not because everything around you has become perfect, but because you have learned how to recognize what truly belongs in your life. When that shift happens, you stop explaining your discernment. You stop forcing connections that feel strained. And perhaps most importantly, you stop negotiating your peace just to maintain familiarity. Peace becomes the boundary that protects your direction. And when you look back at the moments that once confused you, the story begins to look different. What once felt like betrayal may reveal itself as redirection. What once felt like loss may reveal itself as protection. And what once felt like a warning may turn out to be mercy arriving before damage could be done. If this message resonated with you today, take a moment to respond, not out of habit, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the clarity you're stepping into. Like this video if you choose discernment over confusion. Subscribe to Chosen by God if you want faith-based messages that are grounded, wise, and spiritually clear. And if this message spoke directly to something you've been experiencing, leave a comment below and simply write, "I walk in discernment." Because sometimes the greatest shift in life does not come from discovering new information. It comes from finally trusting what your spirit already knew. And remember this as you move forward. God does not reveal people to make you suspicious. He reveals patterns so you can walk in wisdom.